Silas Mercer's first step into the morgue felt like he was crossing into another world. A world where the air tasted colder, and the silence was so heavy it seemed to press against his chest. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting long, unnerving shadows that twisted and shifted along the walls. It felt as if the walls themselves were breathing, expanding and contracting with a life of their own. His footsteps echoed through the cavernous hall, each one unnaturally loud, as if the morgue itself were listening, waiting. He had been excited about the job. Forensic science had always been his passion, and this was his first real step into the field. But now that he was here, standing in the dimly lit hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the cold air, the sterile smell, or the unsettling silence. It was something else, something more. The morgue was sprawling, a labyrinth of cold steel and empty rooms, each one as lifeless as the bodies it contained. The air was thick, heavy, with an almost suffocating stillness that seemed to seep into every corner of the building. The walls stretched out in every direction, and every turn seemed to lead to more of the same, a never-ending hallway of sterile, cold emptiness. The unsettling hum of the overhead lights did nothing to ease his nerves. It only amplified the strange, haunted silence of the place. He was supposed to be excited, eager to start his new role, but something gnawed at the pit of his stomach. The deeper he walked into the morgue, the more claustrophobic the atmosphere felt, like he was sinking into a place where time had no meaning, where death hung in the air and every corner hid a secret. As he reached the end of the hallway, the door to the supervisor's office creaked open, and a tall, gaunt figure emerged. Mr. Larkwood. The man's presence was imposing, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the room like something alive. His eyes, cold and calculating, met Silas's, and for a moment, the young man felt a chill race down his spine. "Ah, you must be the new guy," Mr. Larkwood said, his voice deep and unsettlingly calm. "Silas Mercer, isn't it? Welcome to your new job. I'm sure you've heard the rumors, but let me be clear. The stories are true. This place is different." Silas nodded uneasily, his throat dry. He hadn't heard any of the rumors, at least not the ones Mr. Larkwood was referring to. He had only heard the usual jokes and whispers, things about the dead not being as dead as they seemed. "Here," Mr. Larkwood said, handing him a set of papers, "are the rules. They may seem a little strange at first, but you'll understand soon enough. This is the most important part of your job. Break these rules, and you'll wish you hadn't." Silas's eyes scanned the rules. They seemed harmless enough at first, but something about them sent a shiver down his spine. "Rule 1, Mr. Larkwood continued, never open a body bag without a red tag. If it's not marked, don't touch it. Don't even look inside." Silas frowned. That was odd. He had never worked anywhere that had such a rule. It wasn't like he was a rookie. He'd handled bodies before. But this felt different. There was an undercurrent of fear in Mr. Larkwood's voice that made Silas uneasy. "Rule 2, Mr. Larkwood went on, never engage with the bodies directly. Don't talk to them, don't touch them, don't even look them in the eyes. The moment you do, things happen." Silas's heart thudded in his chest. What did he mean? "Things happen?" he asked, voice shaky. Mr. Larkwood's expression didn't change. He simply nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You'll understand soon enough. Trust me, just don't." Silas felt a cold bead of sweat form on his brow. He had worked with dead bodies before, but the way Mr. Larkwood spoke made it sound like there was something off about these bodies. Something more than just lifeless flesh. "Rule 3, Mr. Larkwood continued, voice now lower, more intense. "If you hear knocking from the cold storage unit, ignore it. Don't even flinch. Just pretend it isn't happening." Knocking. The word rattled in Silas's mind like a hammer hitting bone. "Knocking?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. Mr. Larkwood's gaze hardened. "Yes, and don't ask about it. Just don't." The room felt colder now. The fluorescent lights flickered again and Silas's stomach twisted into knots. He wanted to ask more, but something in Mr. Larkwood's eyes told him that it wasn't a conversation to be had. The supervisor was done explaining. "Rule 4, Mr. Larkwood said, his voice quieter now. "Don't leave the morgue after dark. I don't care if you've finished your shift. You leave, and you might not come back." Every word seemed to settle on Silas like an anchor, dragging him deeper into the dread that already clung to the place. He didn't fully understand it, but he could feel the gravity of the situation. The rules weren't just precautions, they were warnings. Mr. Larkwood stepped back, as though he had delivered the final word. "You'll get used to them," he said, his tone cold, "but don't forget them. Not for a second." Silas stood there, stunned, holding the rules in his hand. It felt like the walls were closing in on him. The silence, the cold, the unnatural quiet of the morgue. It all felt too much. He wanted to leave, but he didn't dare disobey. As he turned to walk back down the hall, the faintest sound reached his ears, a soft, rhythmic thudding like the sound of someone knocking from inside a cold storage drawer. It was distant at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each step he took. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. He glanced back at the supervisor's office, but Mr. Larkwood had already disappeared into the shadows. The knocking continued, louder now, more insistent, like someone or something was trying to get out. Silas hesitated, his curiosity threatening to overtake him. What was it? Who or what was knocking? But then the words from Mr. Larkwood echoed in his mind. "Ignore it. Don't acknowledge it. Just leave it be." He clenched his fists, forcing himself to walk away, but the sound followed him, growing louder with every step. The morgue felt different now. It was no longer just an eerie, cold place. It felt alive, like something was lurking, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As he made his way further down the hall, his mind raced. What was waiting for him here? What had he gotten himself into? And as the sound of knocking reverberated through the morgue's empty halls, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed the threshold into something far darker than he had ever imagined. Silas couldn't shake the knocking. It started as a faint tap, barely noticeable, but over the hours, it grew louder, more rhythmic. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, stress, maybe, from the eerie coldness of the morgue. But no, it was real. The sound echoed in the long, narrow halls of the morgue, vibrating through the thick, oppressive air. It was coming from the cold storage unit. He tried to focus on his work, moving bodies, checking paperwork, the usual duties, but the knock was always there, like an itch he couldn't scratch. Tap, tap, tap. He would stop and listen, holding his breath. It wasn't like the usual creaks and groans the morgue made. This was deliberate, like someone was trying to get attention. A plea? A warning? Silas's heart raced, but he forced himself to ignore it. The rest of his shift passed in a haze. His eyes darted to the cold storage room every few minutes. The knocking grew more insistent. His skin prickled as though the walls themselves were watching him. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his gut, the way the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. Maybe it was a person locked inside one of the drawers. Was it possible someone had been forgotten? Trapped? He knew the rules. He had been warned, but the curiosity clawed at him. Could someone be in trouble? Was it an emergency? What if the knocking was real? A soft shuffle of footsteps snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned to see a tall figure entering the morgue. A man dressed sharply in a black suit. The man's face was a mask of calm, but there was something off about him. Something cold and distant. This was Jonas Elric, the man in charge of the morgue's deliveries. Silas had seen him around a few times, but they had never spoken much. Now, as the man's eyes swept over him, Silas felt a wave of discomfort flood through him. Jonas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, Silas, I see you're settling in well." His voice was smooth, calculated, almost rehearsed. "Yeah," Silas muttered, trying to focus on anything other than the man's presence. "Just getting used to the place." Jonas studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the cold storage unit. Silas couldn't help but notice the way the man's footsteps didn't echo, like he was walking on a surface too soft to make a sound. Jonas paused for a moment, glancing over his shoulder. "The red-tagged bodies, Silas," he said softly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "They're not what they seem. Just don't get too curious." Silas blinked, startled by the sudden intensity in Jonas's words. Before he could respond, Jonas was already turning back to the cold storage unit, his movements smooth, almost unnaturally so. The door clicked shut behind him. Jonas's cryptic warning hung in the air like smoke, but Silas couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a passing comment. There was something he wasn't telling him, something important, something hidden. That night, as the morgue's lights flickered overhead, Silas found himself drawn to the cold storage unit. He knew the rules. He had been warned. But the more he thought about it, the more the curiosity gnawed at him. It was the red-tagged body, he realized. The one that had been moved to a new drawer just the day before. It had caught his attention earlier, as it seemed, out of place. The tag wasn't like the others. There was something unusual about the symbol on it. It didn't look like anything official, and Silas couldn't quite put his finger on why it unsettled him. Against his better judgment, he walked toward the storage room, the air around him growing colder with every step. His heart thudded in his chest, and a sense of foreboding settled over him like a thick fog. He tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, that he was being paranoid. But the knocking, it wouldn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. He approached the row of drawers and stopped in front of the one with the red tag. The cold metal drawer gleamed in the dim light. His breath was shallow as he reached for the handle, his fingers trembling. The sound of his pulse was deafening in his ears. He could hear the knocking now, louder than ever, almost as if it were coming from inside the drawer itself. It was a terrible idea. He knew it was. But then something inside him snapped. He couldn't stand the suspense, the rules, the warnings. They felt irrelevant now, like distant voices fading in the storm. He yanked the drawer open, but it wasn't the body he had expected. There was nothing inside, just emptiness. Silas froze, staring into the cold abyss. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The drawer was completely bare. No body, no corpse, nothing. It was as if the body had never been there in the first place. The knocking sound stopped immediately, replaced by an unsettling silence that seemed to stretch on forever. His hands shook as he looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. The room was still. Everything was still. Then, just as he was about to step back, something caught his eye. A slip of paper tucked in the corner of the drawer where the body should have been. Silas's stomach twisted. He hesitated for only a moment before reaching for the note. The paper was cold to the touch. He unfolded it quickly, his heart hammering in his chest. Written in deep crimson red ink were just a few words. "You're too late." Silas recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. The words seemed to burn into his mind, the ink still fresh, as though it had been written moments ago. He stumbled back, a wave of dizziness crashing over him. His mind raced, spinning with questions. What did this mean? Who had written it? And where was the body? It was gone. But where had it gone? He stood there in the cold room, frozen, his thoughts scrambling. He couldn't make sense of any of it. The rules, the warnings, the knocking. But one thing was clear. He had just broken something important. And now something darker, something much worse, was at play. The sound of his breath was the only thing that filled the room. The knock had stopped. But the silence was just as terrifying. As Silas stepped back, he felt the unmistakable weight of something unseen watching him. A chill crept up his spine. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. He was in over his head. And there was no turning back now. Silas's hands shook as he wiped down the dust-covered shelves in the morgue's cramped storage room. The air smelled of old linen and sterile chemicals. It was the kind of room that no one ever paid much attention to, filled with broken equipment, old files, and boxes of supplies. He had always avoided this part of the morgue, mostly because of the strange sense of abandonment that clung to the place. But today, as part of his usual shift, he had to clean it out. As he moved an old box of unused gloves aside, something caught his eye. A small, leather-bound journal wedged between two rusty filing cabinets. It was worn, the edges of the pages frayed and yellowed with age. A curious sense of unease washed over him as he picked it up. He hadn't seen this before. Silas flipped it open, his eyes scanning the first few pages. The writing was frantic, hurried. It was messy, but he could make out the words. The handwriting was shaky, as though the writer had been under extreme stress. The first entry was dated just over 5 years ago. Dr. Vane's experiments are getting out of hand. She's obsessed. I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong here. The bodies, they aren't like the others. They're alive. Alive, but not alive. She says she's trying to bring them back, but I don't know if that's what she's really doing. I can't stay here anymore. I have to leave before it's too late. Silas's heart rate quickened. Dr. Calavane. The name sounded familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. She had been mentioned in passing by Mr. Larkwood, but the way this former employee, Cassian Thorne, described her made her seem far more sinister. Silas turned the pages, the journal's entries growing more disturbing. Cassian's next entry was even more unsettling. I can hear them at night. The bodies, they knock, they scream. But Dr. Vane just laughs. She says they can't hurt me. I don't know what she's done to them, but they're not the same. I thought I could quit. I thought I could walk away. But you can't leave once you've seen what happens here. The morgue won't let you go. It knows what you've learned. It knows. Silas felt a chill crawl down his spine. The knocking sound. Was it possible that these bodies, the ones he had been so terrified of, were still somehow alive? It couldn't be. Could it? The journal had only made him more anxious, more frightened than ever. But there was more. The final entry that caught his attention was written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl. I tried to leave. I thought I could escape, but the morgue doesn't let you go. Not once you've learned too much. I don't know if I'm still alive or if I've died already. I've seen the red-tagged body. I shouldn't have. It's the key to everything. If you see it, don't touch it. Don't even look at it. The morgue, it wants to use you. It wants your soul. It's too late for me, but maybe you can still leave. Silas's breath caught in his throat. The red-tagged body. The same one he had seen earlier that day, the one with the strange symbol on its tag. Cassian had written about it like it was some sort of cursed thing, a body that should never be touched, a body that contained some terrible secret. Silas felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up as the pieces started to fall into place. Cassian had tried to warn him, to help him under danger, but he had failed, and now it was too late for him. The journal slipped from Silas's fingers, landing with a soft thud on the cold concrete floor. He stared down at it, unable to look away from the final damning words that seemed to burn into his mind. It was too late. He was already involved in something much darker than he had ever imagined. A cold draft swept through the room, and Silas suddenly felt as if he were being watched. He turned around, but there was no one there, just the empty, lifeless shelves. But the feeling wouldn't leave him. He could still hear the knock echoing through the walls of the morgue, louder now, more urgent. His pulse quickened as the weight of the journal's contents pressed down on him. Was Cassian telling the truth? Was it the morgue itself that had trapped him here, the same way it had trapped Cassian? The room felt smaller now, suffocating. His stomach churned as he realized how far gone the situation had become. And then, just as he was about to leave, a figure stepped out from behind one of the darkened corners of the room. It was Jonas Elric. He was watching Silas, always watching. The chill in the room seemed to grow more intense, and Silas could feel the man's eyes on him, burning, like they could see straight through him. Jonas's voice was low, almost a whisper. I see you found Cassian's journal. Silas's throat tightened. What does it mean? What is this place really? His voice cracked with fear, but Jonas only gave him a small, knowing smile. You should have stayed away, Jonas said, his tone eerily calm. Some things are better left forgotten. Silas felt a knot form in his stomach. What's going on here? What's happening with the bodies? Why are they alive? His words came out in a frantic rush, each question more desperate than the last. Jonas didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his face now inches from Silas's. His eyes were shadowed, darkened by something that Silas couldn't quite place. For a moment, the two men stood there in silence, the tension thick in the air. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Jonas spoke again. The morgue doesn't let you leave. Not once you've learned the truth. Silas's heart hammered in his chest. What truth? What do you mean? But Jonas only smiled again, stepping back into the shadows. You'll find out soon enough, he said, his voice lingering in the air like a bad memory. The coldness in the room pressed down on Silas as he stood there, the journal's words still echoing in his mind. The warning was clear. He was in too deep. The morgue was alive, watching, waiting. And now that he knew the truth, there was no way out. The knock began again, louder this time, almost deafening. Silas's stomach dropped. It was closer than before, as if it were coming from behind him. His skin crawled. He had to find out what was going on before it was too late. But as he turned to leave the storage room, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over him. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the weight of something terrible. Something was coming, and Silas had no choice but to face it. Silas couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of the morgue were closing in on him. The knocks had grown louder, more frequent, and the shadowy figure of Jonas Elric seemed to follow him at every turn. He couldn't get Cassian's journal out of his mind. The terrifying possibilities it painted kept him up at night, his thoughts racing. What if everything in the journal was true? What if the morgue was hiding something far worse than he could imagine? He needed answers, real answers. That's why, after much hesitation, Silas decided to confront the one person who might have the answers he was looking for. Dr. Calavane, the woman who had run the experiments, the woman who was the key to understanding what had been happening in the morgue for years. He had to find her. It took him a while to track her down. She wasn't easy to get a hold of, always elusive, always hiding in the shadows. But Silas was determined. After some persistence, he managed to find her office, tucked away in a far corner of the morgue's sprawling hallways. The door was ajar, and when Silas pushed it open, he was greeted by an unnerving silence. Dr. Vane was sitting at a desk, scribbling something into a notebook. Her calm demeanor was unsettling, like she wasn't aware of the chaos swirling around her. Her office looked sterile, clinical, the walls lined with bookshelves filled with medical texts, journals, and strange, unmarked files. There was something about her that made Silas uneasy, a coldness to her presence that seemed to radiate from every corner of the room. She didn't look up when Silas stepped inside. She just continued writing as though he wasn't even there. "Dr. Vane?" Silas's voice felt small in the room. She paused for a moment before slowly lifting her head, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him flinch. She didn't speak for several seconds, studying him, her gaze unblinking. Finally, she gave a small, cryptic smile. "I've been expecting you, Silas," she said, her voice smooth, almost too calm. "You've been poking around, haven't you?" Silas's heart skipped a beat. I need to know what's going on here. The bodies, the experiments. What is this place really?" His voice was shaky, betraying his fear, but he couldn't stop now. He had to know the truth. Dr. Vane leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together. "You're curious, I see, but curiosity comes with consequences." She looked at him with a knowing smile, her eyes cold and detached. "The morgue isn't just a morgue, Silas. It's a place of experimentation, but you're not ready to understand that yet. Not fully." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Silas felt a chill creep up his spine. "Experimentation?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "What kind of experiments?" Dr. Vane didn't answer right away. Instead, she slowly stood up and walked over to one of the bookshelves. She picked up a small glass vial filled with an amber liquid, holding it up to the light. "The kind of experiments that seek to defy the natural order of life and death," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "We're studying the boundary between the two, the liminal space." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "These bodies you see here, they aren't dead, not entirely. They are in a state of suspension, not quite alive, but not fully dead either. We've learned how to keep them in that state, to stop time in a way." Silas's mind raced as he tried to process her words. "You mean they're alive? They're not dead?" Dr. Vane nodded slowly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Exactly. They're alive in the sense that their organs still function, their hearts still beat, but they don't age, they don't decay. They remain in this perfect state, trapped between life and death. It's the next step in human evolution, Silas. Immortality." Her words struck Silas like a punch to the stomach. Immortality? What kind of monstrous thing was she trying to create? "And the red-tagged body?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound composed. "What's the deal with that?" Dr. Vane's smile faltered for just a moment, but it was enough for Silas to see that she knew something he didn't. "Ah, the red-tagged body. It's part of the special experiments, the most advanced. It's not a corpse, not by any means. It's one of the first successful subjects. We've been keeping it alive for much longer than any human should be capable of." She paused, watching his reaction carefully. "It's special." Silas felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The thought of a body being kept alive beyond the limits of nature was too much to comprehend. But something in Dr. Vane's eyes told him there was more. Something she wasn't telling him. "There's more, isn't there?" Silas pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's really going on here? Why are you doing this?" Dr. Vane's smile returned, but this time it was colder, more calculating. She stepped closer to him, her presence overwhelming. "You still don't understand, do you, Silas? You're already part of it. This experiment, I've been watching you. The moment you walked into this morgue, you were already involved. There's no way out now." Silas's stomach dropped. What did she mean by that? He couldn't grasp what she was saying, but every instinct in him told him that he was in deeper than he had ever imagined. Why? Why me? Silas's voice cracked, his fear overwhelming him now. Dr. Vane didn't respond at first. She simply tilted her head slightly, as though considering his question. Then, in a low, almost pitying tone, she spoke again. "Because you've learned too much. You've uncovered the truth, and once you've seen what's behind these walls, once you've seen the bodies, you can never leave." The room seemed to close in on Silas as he stood there, frozen. His breath was shallow, and his heart pounded in his chest. The knock sounded again, louder this time, echoing through the halls like a warning. But it was too late. He was already part of whatever nightmare this place had become. Dr. Vane smiled again, the light in her eyes flickering with something darker. "Be careful, Silas. You've stepped into something much bigger than you realize, and you're already involved." With that, she turned and walked back to her desk, leaving Silas standing there in the silence, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. The morgue wasn't just a place of death. It was a trap, and he had already become a part of it. Silas was starting to feel the weight of his choices more heavily now. Every corner of the morgue seemed to hold secrets, and each time he uncovered something, it only deepened the mystery. The red-tagged bodies, the knocks that echoed in the silence, the strange rules he was told to follow, it was all becoming too much. It was as if something was pulling him deeper into a place he would never escape from. He was alone in the morgue that night, as usual, working the graveyard shift. The hours stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The cold air in the room made him shiver, and the quiet was unbearable. He was cleaning one of the cold storage drawers when he heard the door open behind him. He froze. The only person who would come through those doors at this hour was the delivery worker. Arden Blythe, a man Silas had seen around but never spoken to, stepped into the room. He was dressed in a faded uniform, his face shadowed by the dim light. But there was something about his presence that felt different. He wasn't the kind of person to make small talk, and his quiet demeanor made Silas uneasy. "Night shift?" Arden asked, his voice low, almost like he was trying not to disturb the silence. Silas nodded, trying to keep the conversation casual, but Arden didn't seem interested in small talk. He just stared at the cold storage drawers, his eyes scanning the room as if he was looking for something, or avoiding something. After a moment, he turned to Silas, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You've been here long?" Arden asked, his tone almost cautious, as if testing the waters. "Not long," Silas replied, his curiosity piqued. "Why?" Arden sighed, a heavy, tired sound, and walked over to the nearest wall. He leaned against it, his eyes distant, as if recalling a memory from long ago. "I used to work here," he said, his words drawing Silas in. "Long before you came. But I don't work here anymore, not by choice." Silas tilted his head, not sure if he was hearing this correctly. "What do you mean?" Arden glanced over at him, his eyes suddenly sharp, filled with a strange intensity. "You don't want to know everything about this place, kid. Trust me. Some things are better left buried." But Silas couldn't help himself. His curiosity was a constant itch, one he could never ignore. He leaned in, urging Arden to continue. "What happened?" Arden hesitated, looking around as though making sure no one else was listening. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The bodies here. They're not dead, at least not the way you think. You know about the red tags, right?" Silas nodded slowly, his heart beginning to race. He had learned about them, but Arden's words made him uneasy. "What about them?" Arden took a deep breath and ran a hand through his hair, looking like he was trying to find the right words. "Those bodies, they're part of something bigger, something twisted. It's not just a morgue, it's an experiment. And if you get too close to the truth, they won't let you leave. Not without paying a price." Silas felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His heart pounded in his chest. What do you mean? What happened to you? Arden's gaze turned hard, and for a moment, Silas could see a flash of fear in his eyes. I tried to leave. After I figured it all out, I tried to quit, but you can't leave. Not once you've seen what goes on here. It gets in your head. It makes you do things. He paused, his face grim. And the people who really run this place? It's not Mr. Larkwood. It's Jonas Elric. He's the one pulling the strings. He's the one behind all of this. Silas's mind was spinning. Jonas Elric, the ominous figure he had seen watching him from the shadows, was involved in this? The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to click together, but the picture it formed was darker and more terrifying than anything he had imagined. I don't understand, Silas murmured. What are they trying to do? Why the living bodies? Arden's expression twisted into something like pain. They're trying to cheat death, to create something that can live forever. The red-tagged bodies, they're not dead, but they're not alive either. They're in between, and they're not just experimenting on the bodies. They're experimenting on people, anyone who gets too close. Cassian Thorne, for example, he figured it out. He saw too much, and then he disappeared. Silas's stomach churned. Disappeared? What happened to him? Arden didn't answer right away. He just stared at the cold storage drawers, his eyes distant, lost in thought. I don't know, he finally said. But I can tell you this, once you start asking the wrong questions, you're marked. You're part of the experiment, and they'll never let you go. Silas felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. His hands trembled. I don't understand. Why didn't you just leave when you had the chance? Arden's face twisted into a bitter smile. I tried. I really did. But the morgue doesn't let you go. You get too deep, and when you get too deep, there's no way out. No one who truly understands the morgue's secrets ever leaves. Ever. The room seemed to grow colder. The air felt thick, suffocating. Silas's heart was racing, his thoughts a blur of terror and confusion. He wanted to believe Arden was just paranoid, that he was mistaken. But something told him that Arden was telling the truth. And just as Silas opened his mouth to ask another question, a sudden bone-chilling screech erupted from one of the cold storage units behind them. The sound was so loud, so raw, it made the floor shake. Silas spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The screech was followed by a heavy thud, and then nothing but silence. Arden didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He just stared at Silas, his expression unreadable. That's them, he said softly, his voice eerily calm. It's not the dead making that noise, it's the living. Silas's blood ran cold. He couldn't breathe. His body froze in place as the reality of Arden's words sank in. He wasn't just dealing with a morgue. He wasn't just working in a place of death. He was in the middle of something far worse, something that had already claimed more than one life. And now it seemed it was coming for him. Silas took a step back, but Arden's eyes never left him. The delivery worker's warning had just become all too real. Then the screeching started again, louder this time. And Silas knew, without a doubt, that he had just crossed a line he could never return from. Silas couldn't stand it any longer. Every day he fought the pull of the red-tagged body, but now it felt like there was no turning back. The unease in his gut had built up to something far worse than just curiosity. He had to know. The knocking from the cold storage units, the warnings from Arden, and the strange things he had uncovered about Dr. Calavain's experiments. All of it had led him here. There was no going back now. He stood in front of the cold storage drawer where the red-tagged body was kept. The familiar, flickering light above cast long shadows over the morgue, but Silas could feel his heartbeat loud in his ears. His hand shook as he reached for the handle, but he forced himself to open it. The drawer slid open with a sickening creak. The body inside was pale, almost unnaturally so, and it lay still, as if waiting for something. But the moment Silas looked into its face, something changed. The eyes, those lifeless, glassy eyes, blinked open, slowly, almost deliberately. Silas froze, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The bodies in the morgue were dead, weren't they? This body was dead, right? But the eyes staring back at him were anything but lifeless. The body let out a low, rasping sound, the words barely a whisper, but they pierced the heavy silence like a blade. You're too late. It's already begun. Silas stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind couldn't process what had just happened. That body, alive, blinking at him, wasn't supposed to be alive. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs refused to move. He felt paralyzed, caught in the grip of a nightmare that had just come to life. The words echoed in his mind, "It's already begun." What did it mean? What had he gotten himself into? Panic crept in like ice water, freezing his thoughts. Then something else caught his eye. A new red tag. It was hanging from a hook beside the drawer. Silas's stomach twisted as he realized the truth. He hadn't just stumbled upon the body. He hadn't just violated the rules. He was part of the experiment now. His name was written clearly on the tag. It felt like a death sentence, like his fate had already been sealed. Before he could process what was happening, the door behind him creaked open, and Silas turned to see Jonas Elric standing in the doorway. The tall man's presence was suffocating, like a shadow that stretched far too far into the room. His eyes were calm, too calm, and they focused on Silas as if he were already dead. "You're here," Jonas said, his voice low, almost clinical. "I was wondering when you'd find your way." Silas's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he couldn't speak. His mouth felt dry, like it was filled with cotton. "What's happening?" he managed to croak, his voice trembling with fear. "What is all this? Why are the bodies alive? What does the red tag mean?" Jonas stepped closer, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "The red tags? They mark those who are chosen for the experiment. You, Silas, are the next subject. You've already been marked, whether you realize it or not." The words hit Silas like a punch to the stomach. He couldn't breathe. The world seemed to spin around him as he tried to make sense of what Jonas was saying. "Experiment? What are you talking about? What do you mean? Chosen?" Jonas's smile was thin like a blade's edge, and it made Silas shiver. "You've heard the rumors. The living bodies. The bodies that don't die, no matter how much time passes. Dr. Calavain's research was always about more than just keeping people alive. It's about replacing life, about transferring the soul of the living into a preserved body. Immortality." Silas's knees went weak. He grabbed the edge of the drawer to steady himself, but his vision swam, the words crashing against him in waves. You want to transfer my soul?" Jonas nodded slowly, as if he were explaining something simple like the weather. "Yes. Your body is already a part of the process. The red tag means you've been chosen to join the experiment, to become part of something greater. But only if you're willing." The air felt suffocating. Silas's mind raced, struggling to comprehend what Jonas was saying. This wasn't a morgue. It wasn't just a place where dead bodies were kept. This was a factory for immortality, using real people as test subjects. His heart hammered in his chest as he glanced at the body in the drawer, still staring at him with its dead yet not dead eyes. "What happens to me?" Silas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jonas's smile faded, and his eyes darkened. "You'll be preserved, in a new body, one that never ages. You'll be part of the experiment, but you have to make the choice. Either you join us, or you're nothing. Just another body to be disposed of." Silas's mind reeled. He could barely breathe, his thoughts too scattered to focus. How had it come to this? He had come here to work, to learn, and now he was trapped in something far worse than a nightmare. He looked back at the body in the drawer, its eyes still open, still watching him. The same eyes that had warned him. "You're too late." The weight of the words crushed him. The realization hit like a tidal wave. He hadn't been chosen for the experiment. He had already been part of it from the very beginning. The red tag had always been waiting for him. There was no escape. Jonas's voice broke through his thoughts, cold and steady. "The process has already begun, Silas. There's no turning back now. You've already been marked." And as Silas stood there, staring at the body in front of him, he understood the horrifying truth. This was no longer just about the morgue. This was about a cycle, one that never ended. The bodies in the drawers weren't dead. They were waiting, just like he would be, waiting to be brought back, to live again, in a new body, in a new form. But he wasn't sure if he would ever truly be himself again. And then, Jonas's final words sealed his fate. "Welcome to eternity, Silas." The door shut behind him with a resounding thud. Silas was left alone with the body, with his own future, and with the terrifying knowledge that he was already part of something far beyond his control. The red tag on the drawer flickered, the name glowing dimly in the dark. Silas's heart pounded as he stumbled away from Jonas, the chilling truth crashing down on him like a wave. He had to get out. He had to escape. The morgue was a prison, a trap, and he was the next victim. His breath came in short gasps as he turned and ran for the door, the cold air of the morgue wrapping around him like a vice. He reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door wouldn't open. His fingers fumbled with the cold metal, but it was as if the building itself was alive, holding him in place, not allowing him to leave. Panic surged through him. His entire body screamed for freedom, but the walls seemed to close in, the air thick and suffocating. The morgue was not just a place, it was a living, breathing thing that didn't want him to leave. He spun around, his eyes wide with terror, and saw Jonas standing at the far end of the hallway, blocking the way. Mr. Larkwood appeared behind him, his face expressionless. The two men watched him, their eyes cold and knowing. Jonas's smile twisted with something dark, something that made Silas's blood run cold. "You can't leave, Silas," Jonas said, his voice low and mocking. "Not anymore." "What do you mean?" Silas shouted, his voice cracking with fear. He ran back to the door and yanked on the handle again, but it still wouldn't open. "Please, let me go. I don't want to be a part of this. I don't want." "You already are," Mr. Larkwood interrupted, his voice eerily calm. He stepped forward, his face stern. "It's too late for that. The experiment is already in motion." Silas's stomach churned. His thoughts swirled like a storm, each new piece of the puzzle fitting together with sickening clarity. The red tags, the bodies, the strange rituals, the living corpses. He wasn't just a witness. He wasn't just someone who had stumbled into something he shouldn't have. He had been part of this from the very beginning. They had chosen him. The morgue had chosen him. He had been marked. He turned to Jonas, his chest tight with panic. No, this isn't happening. You can't do this. You can't take me. I won't let you." Jonas's eyes flashed with cold amusement. "It's not up to you anymore, Silas. The process has already started. Your body is being prepared. You're already part of it." Silas felt a wave of nausea hit him as the realization hit hard. His hands shook, his breath coming in short gasps. His body was already being changed, already being prepared to become one of them. The living dead, the ones that had been kept in those drawers for so long. Preserved, waiting to be brought back to life in a new body, a new vessel. "No," Silas gasped, his hands trembling as they pressed to his chest. "No, you're lying. I can't be part of it. I haven't agreed to any of this." Jonas took a slow step forward, his eyes narrowing. "You never had a choice. Not when you stepped foot in this morgue. This place doesn't let anyone go once it's marked you. Not once it's already started." Silas felt a sharp pain shoot through his chest, and he stumbled back, his vision blurring. The walls around him seemed to close in tighter, suffocating him. His body felt wrong, cold, rigid. Something was happening to him. He looked down at his hands and gasped. His skin was pale, almost translucent. His fingers seemed stiffer than before. His heart was racing, but it felt distant, like it was slowing down, fading away. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling with horror. "What's happening to me?" Jonas stood still, watching him with an unreadable expression. "You're becoming part of the process, Silas. You're becoming one of us. Your body is already shutting down, already starting the change. The experiment doesn't wait." Silas screamed, his mind unable to grasp the full weight of what was happening to him. His body felt like it was freezing, like his bones were turning to stone. The world around him became distant, as if he were sinking deeper and deeper into a nightmare. His heart thundered in his chest, but the rhythm was slowing, the beats becoming faint. His legs buckled and he collapsed to his knees. His body felt like it was being pulled apart, torn in two. Every movement, every breath was harder than the last. He could feel the cold creeping deeper into his flesh, taking over his limbs, his muscles, his very soul. No, this isn't. I'm still me," he cried out. But the words felt hollow. His body wasn't his anymore. His soul was slipping away, being replaced by something else. Something that didn't belong. Something that was never supposed to exist. Jonas and Mr. Larkwood stood over him, watching as he struggled, helpless. The red tag still hung by the drawer, like a silent marker of his fate. There was no escape, no way out. Silas was already a part of the experiment, already a part of the morgue. His soul was already being bound to a new immortal vessel. And in that moment, Silas understood the terrible truth. There was no escaping the morgue, no escaping the cycle. Once it had marked you, you were nothing more than another body waiting to be preserved. The pain in his chest grew unbearable, and his vision went dark. The last thing he saw before everything faded was the red tag, glowing faintly in the shadows. His name was written on it, clear as day. And then there was nothing. The morgue had won. Silas was just another red-tagged body now.